My name is George Demokopoulos. I'm the co-founding director of the Orthodox Christian Study Center at Fordham University. Our center facilitates, finances, and publishes academic research related to the Orthodox Christian world, broadly understood. And today we have what I think will be a really fascinating discussion among Byzantinists about the term Byzantine and Byzantium. The splashy title I managed to come up with is it time to decolonize the terms Byzantine and Byzantium? This is just one of a number of initiatives that the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham hosts. We actually have a new webinar series run by our colleague in Russian Studies at Fordham, Michael Sorgan. That series is called The Russia Question. And tomorrow, he will have episode 2 of that webinar series, where he will be interviewing Drs. Scott Kenworthy and Alexander, I knew I would mispronounce this, Agajanian, and their book, Understanding World Christianity, Russia. So tune in tomorrow as well for that webinar. So is it time to decolonize the terms Byzantine and Byzantium? The people we call Byzantine self-defined as Romans. This is generally well known among scholars. The terms Byzantine and Byzantium were first employed by Western scholars about a century after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, in an effort to differentiate what they perceived to be the authentic classical Roman Empire from its later Eastern and Christian derivation. For centuries, these terms, Byzantine and Byzantium, circulated within Western scholarship with a not so subtle sense of derogatory critique. One only needs to read what Edward Gibbon says about the Byzantines. Perhaps ironically, the terms Byzantine and Byzantium, however, have subsequently been embraced by Orthodox Christian populations who tend to view the period as a golden age of Christian civilization. Our panel this afternoon will explore these issues and many more and debate the viability or suitability of changing the terminology for the field. So, who are our panelists? First, we have Dr. Elizabeth Bolman. She engages with visual culture of the Eastern Mediterranean in the late antique and Byzantine periods. She is best known for her work in Egypt, in which she has demonstrated the vitality of Christian Egyptian art and presented new understandings of the nature of artistic production in the early Byzantine and medieval periods. Currently, she is completing a gender studies analysis of depictions of the Byzantine Galactophrousa, the nursing Virgin Mary. She is currently chair of the Department of Art History at Case Western Reserve University, where she is beginning a new initiative called Art Lab CLE, focusing on intersections of art history and technology. Dr. Anthony Caldelas is professor and chair of classics at The Ohio State University. He has published many books and articles on aspects of Byzantine history, culture, and literature, including its reception of the classical past and its Roman identity. He has translated many Byzantine historians into English and is currently writing a new big history of the Eastern Empire from 324 to 1461 AD. I'm curious to hear more about that end date. Dr. Leonora Neville, who's responsible for this entire thing because of some comments she made at the last Byzantine Studies Conference. Dr. Neville studies the culture and society of the Eastern Roman Empire. Note, not the Byzantine one, particularly history writing, gender, and the importance of the classical past for medieval Roman culture. Her work explores how performances of culturally normative behaviors create and construct freedom and authority. Recently, she has offered a new interpretation of how the rhetoric of Anna Komnene's Alexiad worked to portray Anna as a good historian, even though she was a woman, and a good woman, even though she wrote history, and how the modern misinterpretation of those strategies has led to Anna's reputation as a power-hungry schemer. Last but not least, we have Dr. Ionuț Alexandru Tudori, Alex by his friends, who is academic dean and professor of church history at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. Within the broader frames of Byzantine and Southeast European history, he specializes in the relationship between church and state, as well as the medieval theological controversies between Eastern and Western Christian traditions. Current research projects include work on Ottoman-era Christian pilgrims to Constantinople, as well as the relationship between the Greek Orthodox community in Jerusalem and the Ottoman government. So everyone, we will introduce each of our, I'm going to invite each of our speakers to offer a very brief entry point into this conversation, taking whatever perspective or angle they want. The colonial angle is one of my own. I'm not expecting all of our speakers to necessarily engage it. We'll go one by one quickly. We will then open it up to a panel conversation between our guests. And then maybe 2/3 of the way through the hour, I will begin to field questions from the Q&A. So those of you out there watching us live, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your panel. And we will get to as many questions and have as many answers as we possibly can. So first, Dr. Bolman.
Can everyone see me?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, thanks very much for this invitation. I'm honored to be part of this group. I'm just gonna dive right in. So for the last 25 years, I've worked on monuments in Egypt. When I began, I accepted the assumptions common to art historians at the time that Egypt was a place apart and was inhabited by Copts, that is to say, Egyptian Christians, C-O-P-T-S. According to this paradigm, the Copts were not Byzantines. Those assumptions now seem ludicrous to me. They were based on preconceived, often racially motivated ideas and demonstrated with portable objects. These movable works of art were identified as illusionistic and called Hellenic or Hellenistic, and their place of production was typically identified as Constantinople. If works of art were not illusionistic, they were typically ascribed to places in the provinces. So the red and white monasteries in Egypt prove emphatically that not just Egypt, but Upper Egypt, which is to say southern Egypt, was a full participant in both receiving and generating visual culture. Egypt was the wealthiest province in the empire with an immeasurable number of close ties to Constantinople and the rest of the Mediterranean region. Papyrologists and other historians have known this for a very long time, and art historians have been slow to catch up. So I've spent many years arguing that Egypt was a major part of the early Byzantine Empire. I want to return briefly to the term Copt before going back to Byzantine. The word Copt derives from the Arabic Gibt and simply means Egyptian. The Arab conquest of the mid-7th century did not at first change the culture of the early Byzantines living in Egypt. By the late 9th or early 10th century, however, the Christians of Egypt had become native Arabic speakers and were part of the Muslim-dominated world. It is therefore correct to refer to Egyptian Christians at this later date, including up until today, as Copts, but this is not the case for the early Byzantine period. Now that I and a few others, most notably Thelma Thomas and Laszlo Torok, have demonstrated the early Byzantine character of Egypt using visual data, I am ironically struggling to find a way to jettison the term Byzantine altogether. I agree with Leonora Neville that more precise terminology is long overdue. Thus, I would now prefer to refer to the Byzantine Empire as the medieval Roman Empire in the East. This is a bit of a mouthful, especially with qualifications such as early, middle, and late added to it. In conclusion, I have a question for all of you. With Scott Johnson and Jack Tanous, I organized a Dumbarton Oaks Spring Symposium entitled Worlds of Byzantium a few years ago. Our principal goal was to emphasize the culturally polyglot character of the empire. We problematized the notion that its overwhelming and most meaningful contributions were Greek. We have just submitted our book to Cambridge University Press, much expanded from the symposium, and it is now currently still called Worlds of Byzantium. I'd like to invite suggestions as to what we might consider calling it if we decide to change the name. So no promises, but my attempts so far are Worlds of the Medieval Roman Empire in the East, which is definitely not as catchy as Worlds of Byzantium, or Medieval Eastern Worlds of Byzantium. And that is it for my preliminary comments. Thank you.
Dr. Caldelis.
Thank you, George, for this invitation. I hope that I will be forgiven if I take slight issue with the way in which the webinar advertisement was phrased. There is, I believe, a persistent error in the field of Byzantine studies that the term Byzantium and the Byzantines, as we understand it, were invented or deployed for the first time in the 16th century in roughly the way that we use it today. This is not the case. It was not Hieronymus Wolff who came up with the term, and it didn't mean what we think it meant at that time. At that time and down to the 19th century, the term continued to be a synonym for Constantinople, because if medieval Roman Empire is a mouthful, so is the adjective Constantinopolitan, especially in Latin. The practice of using the term Byzantine as an adjective, which is how it was used mostly in early modern Europe, did not create a new classification. So Wolff did not endow history with a new entity, Byzantium. The historical ontology of that society continued to be Greek, as it had been in medieval Western sources since about the late 8th century. So it was defined largely in ethnic terms. Its histories were written as Empire of the Greeks, or sometimes as Empire of Constantinople. If you want to see this play out, you can actually look in Gibbon, who is before the modern revolution that invented Byzantium. He refers to the inhabitants of the Eastern Empire after a certain point when he no longer can recognize them as Romans, as Greeks throughout. For him, Byzantium is the capital. You don't find the Byzantines in Gibbon. So Byzantium is a category that we recognize was invented in the late 19th century, and it was invented out of great power anxiety over two developments, specifically the creation of an irredentist modern Greek state in the Balkans, and secondly, the fear that it was trying to recreate the empire of the Greeks, as all Western historiography talked about Byzantium, and that would be a proxy for Russian imperialism in the region. And so the term Empire of the Greeks was retired in the aftermath of the Crimean War, especially. And by the late 19th century, the vacuous term Byzantium had taken its place precisely in order to avoid the Greek label. So thus, the society that this term designated had lost even its ethnic ontology, misleading though that had been in the Western tradition all along, leaving it for the moment completely empty. The historian John Bury protested against this. He thought it was a great mistake to introduce the term Byzantium, that the category of the Roman Empire should be continued straight on through all the way to the end. But he lost that fight. Now, Empire of the Greeks and Byzantium are both mislabels that are stemming from the original sin of the field, which is Roman denialism. So Western Europe had long since appropriated the Roman legacy as an exclusive possession of itself, and so had to come up with alternative things to call the Eastern Roman Empire, The Greek Empire was one of them for 1,000 years. Byzantium is the one that we use for the past 130 years or so. I can elaborate on the specifically colonial way in which this played out afterwards if you want. So since both the ethnic aspect and the Roman aspect were ruled out, this society and its civilization had then to be given some new essence. And in the 1930s, which was not a normal period of history by any standard, Byzantium was endowed with a metaphysical ontology. So the framework for study was decreed to be this imperial theological idea, which was sort of cooked up from some hints in panegyrical texts. Every Byzantinist is familiar with this idea about God and the emperor and universal rule and ecumenical empire and so forth. Most of this speaks to the anxieties and debates taking place in the 1930s. But more importantly for our purposes, it set the stage for defining imperial orthodoxy as the historical ontology of this society. And so in the 20th century, most of the scholarship focused on orthodoxy as the defining vector of East Roman identity, which was not called East Roman. So these are some of the things that we need to correct. We need to know this history, we need to correct this picture, and we need to bring it down to earth. In recent years, I have tried to concentrate on the Roman dimension, which I am confident will be restored fully. I don't see any meaningful grounds for reasonable opposition to this. So this problematizes both our definitions of Byzantium and possibly our use of that term. The term isolates our field because it postulates ruptures where none existed. It prevents us from engaging with the work of ancient historians and them with ours. It requires us to accept the conventions of Western medieval historians, and it results in a rather artificial metaphysics that distorts both Romanness and orthodoxy. I should note also that it results in a very, very peculiar field of study, one in which all the standard handbooks and massive histories fail to disclose the name of the state that they're talking about, even though it's written in all the sources. They fail to disclose the name of the language that was being spoken in that state, even though it's well known. So even in the recent Cambridge grammar of medieval Greek, 2,500 pages, they don't actually say what the people who spoke that language called it. So I'll wrap up by saying that we're probably stuck with the term for the short and possibly medium term. I think we need to work out questions of substance and identity before we rush to change it. But I can see no use for it at the moment beyond in the titles of journals, of books, simply to designate the field from which the research is originating. I see no reason within the packaging of our research to ever refer to Byzantium or the Byzantines. There are perfectly good terms in the sources that we can use.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, George, for the opportunity to speak and join this conversation. I think that we have a strong imperative to drop the terminology of Byzantium and Byzantine because first, that terminology was developed to help construct a worldview in which Western domination and colonization of the globe was both natural and good. Second, that terminology continues to distort our research. And third, it lacks integrity. So the terminology of Byzantium has multiple functions and does a lot of different things, some of which Anthony just mentioned. And today, I'm going to do one for matters of time. That the Eastern Roman Empire was turned into Byzantium in order to cut it out of the history of Western Europe and to create a cleaner narrative of the rise of the West, in which Western Europeans rediscovered the glories and the rationality of antiquity on their way to enlightenment and a Roman-like domination of the world. And so the existence of a Homer quoting, Aristotle reading classical Roman Empire alive and kicking in the Eastern Mediterranean throughout the Middle Ages throws a significant monkey wrench into that narrative of the rise of the West. So history had to change. The medieval Roman politia had to be hidden from view, and the Eastern Romans had to be replaced by Byzantines or by Greeks or by somebody other than Romans, right? Who, through a strongly derogatory and highly gendered late 19th century discourse, were cast, these Byzantines, as feminine, superstitious, slavish, and supine, all of which worked to construct the West as masculine, rational, and dominant. And this gendered derogatory discourse of, quote, Byzantium justified both the 13th century conquest and colonization of the Eastern Empire and the 19th century and 20th century colonization of the Middle East. And I think when we continue to use the terminology of Byzantium and Byzantine, we are upholding that worldview and that schematization of history. And second, separating Byzantium from the earlier Eastern Roman Empire distorts our research because it cuts the subject we're studying in half. And if we look at the medieval phase of Eastern Roman society as if the earlier phase were completely irrelevant, which in some subfields, they do start at 300 and pretend that nothing ever happened before then, right? If we do that, separate our fields into two halves, we are going to be distorting our research. It creates different fields and different subfields, different problems, but I think all are affected. And if the terminology of Byzantium were truly an innocent convention, a term of art that doesn't have any baggage and does not distort our studies, then we wouldn't have so much trouble dropping it. The persistence with which scholars continue to talk about Byzantium indicates that that terminology does something for us. We continue to prefer Byzantium to the reality that we know that we study. And we need to ask ourselves why. Because once we understand what talking about that fake category of Byzantium does for us, we'll be better placed to understand the contemporary intellectual and social constructs that are affecting and shaping our research. It's easier to see the ones in the late 19th century. Oh, it's about the Crimean War, right? That's easier for us to see than why are we doing it now? Is it just because the journal titles? Other fields change their journal titles. Right? There's something unsatisfying in that explanation. It's not clear to anybody. No one ever got in a bus and said, I study Byzantium, and have people say, oh, that explains everything. I know exactly what you're doing. Right? It doesn't mean anything to anybody. Right? So we need to figure out what it is that makes this terminology continue to be helpful for us. And since these constructs, they don't derive from anything in the medieval evidence, I think they necessarily introduce distortions into our research. And finally, I think that this terminology lacks integrity, by which I mean the literal sense of having a match and a concord between what we do, what we say, and what we think. And if we read in a medieval text that it says one thing, and then we turn and we say something else, that's a lapse in our integrity. Right? And if our goal is to respect the dead, we should stop lying about them. And if our goal is to speak truth about the past as historians, we need to speak truth. And talking about Byzantium is just kind of lying. So thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm honored to be one of the panelists for today's webinar. I have to confess, I have to start with a confession. Being educated in a department of Orthodox theology, the first definitions of the Byzantine Empire that I remember from that time were obviously coming from August Heisenberg, highlighting somehow the three fundamental elements that are well known to all of us, that the Byzantine history is the history of the Christianized Roman Empire of the Greek nation. I am still struggling and actually formulating and basing my my own opening course for Byzantine history, somehow based on this definition. And the second definition that I remember from this very first class I took in Byzantine history was coming from Sir Stephen Runciman, where Byzantium is. For him, Byzantium was obviously, with a very, very Christian perspective, the empire of God on earth, a pale image of the heavenly kingdom. With that being said, I have to confess that after reading Professor Caldelli's book, 2019, The Roman Land, I connected two dots. In particular, I connected the question marks I had all the time when I was going through sources and recognizing that, you know, Byzantines they were just simply calling themselves as Romans. And I was always puzzled by that, but was not necessarily pursuing that idea to discover why was that, and to give an answer for myself. And secondly, also from the beginning of my study of Byzantine history, even the simple fact of trying to define when we can start this history of the new empire, of the Byzantine Empire. Is it Constantine the Great, or we should just simply move up to Heraclius with different other possibilities? It was, for the first time, probably a big question mark about the terminology that maybe we can revise. Finally, after giving several thoughts to the sources and especially the detailed analysis provided by Professor Kaldelis, I was thinking that I should simply connect another dot with a Romanian historian, a famous Romanian historian from the interwar period. This is Gheorghe Brătianu. And he was trying to define exactly the origin and to explain how the Romanian people, how was that possible for the history to survive in a very complicated geography, history, and so on. And the title of his famous book from that time is The Miracle or the Enigma of Romanian people. And I would like to position myself in trying to answer this question exactly into, I'm leaning towards Paul Magdaleno's opening window for further research without being very precise, using exactly the words of Brătianu, that we have in front of us a kind of a miracle, and we have in front of us a vast enigma. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, everyone. So I'll ask everyone to come on screen, and we will do a kind of roundtable now. And in fact, I'd like to begin by simply inviting anyone to respond to anyone else, right? Is there anyone that wants to jump on something someone said? Let's just start there, because each in your own way, you provided really rich content for us to think with. Leonora, I think you wanted to go.
I just wanted to give a quick response to Betsy's question about what to call the book. And how about Eastern Roman worlds? And I think that the subjects that you're working with do wonderful things for breaking down sort of the ethnic stories that people are telling, and saying that you're talking about material that is crossing between language groups in different ways. So just that particular thought.
And how do we identify medieval, though? I mean, so that people don't think we're talking about Hellenistic worlds.
Well, if it's Eastern Roman, I think that's pretty good. And you're going to be starting early.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. You're right.
And Ptolemy starts the whole thing off. I mean, should it be Pompey? Can't we do that? You know?
You have an answer for everything. I love it. Okay. Scott and Jack are ready to kill me right now, but I like it. So, okay. Thank you, Leonora.
Oh, sure.
Well, and aren't titles chosen by presses anyway?
I mean, we are going to have that word in for the classification purposes for a little while. But I think if we get everybody in their field to really interrogate it, as Betsy is doing, think about what are those words that people are using in the source material you're talking about. And we do the work of thinking about who are we studying? What are we doing? And we write compelling work about that. What we're going to be talking about is going to be much more interesting than this glop that we've inherited. Excuse me. Roman land is much more fun than, other things. And then I think that the new temperature, I mean, it's not as if we're taking up that much shelf space at Barnes & Noble. Like, we're really not, as Byzantinists. So I don't see that we have all that much to lose by clinging to tradition rather than coming up with new vocabulary, new ways of articulating what we study, because I think it's a really kind of neat, kind of fascinating.
Anyone else want to jump on some of these opening comments?
So, hi, George, can I, I'm not sure if I'm responding to anyone in particular or all of us, but so I'll pull back from my more sort of strident comments and express some doubts that I occasionally have, which is that when I began to explore, let's say, the domain of Romanness in Byzantium, I have found more than I expected to find. But at the same time, I'm always aware that Byzantium, for lack of as a placeholder, right, is a place of many intersecting histories. And that, for example, the history of Greek literature, things written in Greek, doesn't overlap exactly with the history of Roman things in Byzantium. And the same is true in part for the history of the church. And that these histories sort of weave together for a good long time, but they have different projections into the past, into contemporary societies on either side in different ways. And I'm very, that makes me anxious, not stressed, but that I wouldn't want a term that would cut those off as well. In other words, the variety of early Christian cultures, which might be closer to the material that Elizabeth's volume will contain. I mean, I might be wrong about that, but that variety is a different kind of picture than you get if you look at that same society through the prism of Roman law, Roman identities, governance, those kinds of things, which are existentially significant, right? But I'm not sure that they cover the whole. Anyway, so those are my anxieties.
So, all right. So let me propose this, or this question. Isn't there something distinctive about a mostly Greek-speaking Christian, I know Anthony doesn't think it's Christian, but Christian Roman Empire, right? I mean, isn't there something unique about this field that we've all been engaged in that the term East Roman doesn't fully capture? What do you think?
So I think there absolutely is something unique about it. There's no way to miss Byzantium on the map or in the historical record. There's no way to be looking for it in the way that one might look for medieval Europe, right? Like finding medieval Europe and defining it is a very difficult thing. Byzantium is not, that's not a problem. And it is the product of a unique sort of combination of cultural resources and identities. I think that after a certain point, certainly after the 7th century, East Roman pretty much captures most of it. Before that, I think things are a bit more complicated. But anyway, that's a complexity of periodization. And it's a complexity that makes me feel, so we're trying to reverse engineer a name, having decided already what the parameters are. But for me, the parameters are not those parameters. Like, okay, you can decide to write a history from this year to that year, fine. But I see all of these histories as being much, much longer. And in some cases, they reach to the 20th century, and in some cases, they reach back to antiquity. And so I don't understand why we have to limit ourselves to that particular millennium, that we're given. I think the histories are much longer.
And if I could also take a crack at responding to that one. it's fine. Yes, there's something unique, and yes, we want to be studying that. But to understand it, I think we need to stretch across its definitional characteristic, which is always going to be Christianity. If you think that what is the thing that's really dividing the Romans from the Byzantines, right? And if you take away all the derogatory gendered glop and actually look at the things that people are talking about, it's that Christianity cleaves the empire. Right? And when Gibbon wanted to say that the empire died because of barbarism and religion, right, he had to kill the empire sometime in temporal proximity to, Christianization, right? So now taking Christianity as definitional for Byzantium means that that's what enables people to look at orthodoxy from 325 on and see it as a distinct thing and miss many of the ways that we had other elements of both continuity and change and engagement with earlier forms of Roman religion, right? So I think one of the areas in which there's the most distortion caused by thinking of Byzantium as separate from Rome is in precisely the study of orthodoxy, right? Because if you're studying literature and you see a Homer quote, people know, oh, you got to go back and read Homer, right? You've got to extend the framework of your analysis further back to encompass those texts, right? But if you see an aspect of military religion, right, and you think well, this is the 9th century, it's going to be orthodoxy, people are blind to everything that doesn't look like modern orthodoxy, and they ignore everything that looks like previous stuff. And people don't know because they think, well, you can't expect me to be reading about ancient Roman military religion because I'm studying Byzantine, right? I've seen people at conferences get tremendously affronted when the question is posed, well, you can't possibly expect me to think about legionary religion in the context of these descriptions of religious practices. But, that's part of the history, right? And you can actually see it it's just as clear as the Homer quote in the literary studies, right? So I think that there's so much that I perceive as lost when Byzantium is cast adrift, right? When we put up the walls and say, we're going to look 325 on as a separate thing. That's what I see the loss in our field. And I'd like to sort of stretch it back. And I know that, where you set the posts in your books and your projects is always going to be arbitrary. It's never going to be really right. But I would like to see what happens if we go a generation or two of people studying Eastern Mediterranean, where we go back and we start with, when the Romans conquered the place and make that the, till when the Venetians conquer the place. Right, that's I think that would be fruitful enough that'd be worth doing.
Can I ask Alex to weigh in on this? Alex is, as you all know, teaches a seminary, teaches church history, right? So I want to hear your thoughts on this problematic, I think, that we're hearing about the association with Christianity and the name Byzantium and so forth.
Yeah, sure. I think in a way it's true, but on the other hand, it's the communion that we have between Rome and Constantinople that is definitely going farther than the 11th century and is going up to Ferrara Florence in a way, because we should not operate with a stray schism in the 11th century or necessarily 1204. That would be the bridge that we can actually use to recreate the, and not to divide between Roman history and Byzantine history. That connection between Rome and Constantinople and the history of the church before the First Ecumenical Council that was mentioned here, I think that could be useful for us to use it as a platform for, at a general level, to talk about Eastern Mediterranean as it was mentioned, instead of using it as a dividing force. We should use it as a platform for reconnecting the Roman history with the Byzantine history here.
And Betsy, can you weigh in here? I mean, you work on largely religious art, right? So just bring the art historical perspective into this question about Christianity as the sort of framing of, or the underlying framing of terms and so forth.
I think I'm convinced by Leonora's expansion, and I'm thinking about Peter Brown's demonstration of the fact that in the 5th century, class was more important than religion. And I think about continuities in visual culture. So illusionism, classicism, you know, these themes which were once thought to kind of die away and then reappear in a kind of renaissance are now understood to be continuous and simply one of a range of options. So I guess I like the expansion idea.
All right. So I have all kinds of comments in the chat as well as some questions in the Q&A. I have to do. I have to throw this one in only because Avril Cameron has weighed in, who's watching. So let me read her chat and see if anybody wants to comment, and then I'll go to some of the questions. Avril has written, all naming is exclusionary without exception, Roman included, and Roman historians have been trying to decolonize Rome for a long time already. Rome is the quintessential empire. Do you want to import all these extra imperial and colonial issues? Roman risks closing off the very riches of the Eastern Mediterranean and Islamic worlds that Bolman and Johnson want to promote. A new name will not do the job. What we need is a global concept and a decentered history. So that was Avril weighing in. Okay, so I have a few questions here. Do you think the ontology of imperial orthodoxy and the continued focus on the empire through a religious lens has directly caused other areas, particularly material culture, military history, etc., to suffer? Would anyone like to weigh in on that? Leonora, I'm going to guess that your answer is yes.
You're muted, Leonora.
I think that's one of the areas in which seeing the whole scope of Roman religious history together will do the most change, right? So I think that I don't think that people who identify as Byzantinists have paid much of any attention to the vast changes in the study of ancient religion that took place in the 1990s and early 2000s, even earlier than that. So the way we understand ancient Roman religion is really different from the way that it was when Byzantium was constructed. And I think that we haven't yet taken that on board because most people who do Byzantine religion do Orthodoxy, and that starts with Jesus, and so it moves forward, right? So I think that's the biggest way to answer, Anthony's frustrations with our readings of the panegyric and our statements of sort of political theology, is to really understand Roman civic religion and how it functioned, and use that as the lens for understanding medieval phases of Roman civic religion. So I think that will help a lot. And that will, in some sense, we have to, I think the study of Roman religion is the one that's most out of phase because of the work done by Byzantium, right? So that in art and in literature and in other aspects of society, the change of name is much less of a big deal, right? But when it comes to the study of religion, the change of the name, it starts a new field, which is Orthodox history, right? And Orthodox history doesn't necessarily have to look backwards, right? So that's the one I think that's normalizing religious history of Eastern Mediterranean is going to do a lot. And as part of that, it's not to say that everything is, nascent Greek Orthodoxy. So all of the worlds that Betsy and her collaborators are working on have to be studied too, right? It has to be inclusive of all of that. But I think that will help. And then that will help all these other fields also become more fully studied and more accurately studied. Because a lot of our evidence is religious, and I think we misread a lot of it because we don't see all of it. That's something.
Great. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? I can move on.
May I jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's exactly right that ancient Roman historians have been reckoning with the not only imperial but sometimes colonial histories of their field and the implications of the way in which the Roman Empire has been discussed. For the purposes of our relationship with them, I think it would help them along their path if they came to recognize our field as part of theirs. And they're there already, by the way. They just don't know that all this material exists because we've walled it off from them. But my reading of Roman historians, ancient Roman historians, right now, I keep up with their, what they write about Romanization and so forth, is that they're developing models that interface very directly with the material that we have, but they don't use the material that we have because we've hidden it under a different name. And I think there's a lot of room for fruitful collaboration there, and it would promote the project of decolonizing Roman studies to include, Eastern Greek Orthodox Romans in the basket.
Here's a question from Ivan Moody. What about sublayers of this question? I write a lot about things such as Serbo-Byzantine and Romanian Byzantine art, and more specifically music, which occurred in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Given that the people creating this art use the term Byzantine in these contexts themselves, would you find it problematic to continue using these terms, even though they would, of course, be dissected in written analysis? Right? It's sort of a question about, we've had this, it's like the historiography question, right? People have been engaging this term and building off of it and constructing their own identities. I mean, I think Alexander and I can speak about this within the Orthodox world, right? People are constructing their own identities on these terms, right? So how does, a panel of art and art historians and historians who want to change the world kind of like just throw bombs on all of these other circles? So yeah, Betsy.
And so I just, I don't have an answer to that. I just want to say that it has been a little challenging engaging with my Coptic colleagues to say, for example, that the Red Monastery isn't Coptic. And so the way that I've gotten around that is to say that it's part of the Coptic heritage, because it's part of their heritage, but it's not what I would call Coptic. But indeed, these issues of self-identification and self-identification are really problematic. Continuing with Coptic, Arieta Papakonstantinou has demonstrated quite persuasively that the Egyptian church in the decades after the conquest invented a history for itself, according to which everyone was Miaphysite and ethnically Egyptian. And so we have ancient historical sources telling us that the Copts were all, the same thing before the Arab conquest. And it's taken quite a while for us to figure out that that's a mirage.
I think mirages are really important to people. And I would hold there's a certain amount of respect in believing what people say about themselves. So if there's somebody in an Orthodox church who's singing Byzantine music and says, do Byzantine music, right? To say, no, you don't, is just rude, right? And when people write the history of church music in America, I hope that there is a section on Byzantine music, because there are people who do that. And part of the fun of studying American history is seeing where all these layers come from. Why is it that these people say they do Byzantine music? And what do they mean by that? So I think a nuanced cultural history of these terminology, and like with Betsy's coworkers. You don't want to say, no, this isn't Coptic, right? You want to say, well, this is how it plays into what you're doing. And your sense of self should not be disrupted because we're finding out that history, but it can be greatly enriched by understanding how things change. And one of the hard things about history is that everything has a history. And so cultural traditions that rely on ideas that we've always been the same always have a rub when it comes to history because, not so much.
I just want to underscore Leonore's use of the word fun. I think that approaching these very sensitive and intense topics with a certain lightheartedness is salutary.
And may I add that it is not unprecedented in the history of scholarship for a discipline to be studying of people in antiquity or whenever, and then to suddenly have a modern group of people burst on the scene claiming to be those very people, the descendants of those people you're studying, witness Greece. Yeah. And yet somehow classical Greek scholarship carries on and modern Greece is understood to be a different field. And we don't, go there. And in the 19th century, there was some pretty nasty kind of literature written about the discontinuities there and all that, but that's not how scholars operate today. So, that can be a model for any group that comes along. There are people who claim to be and believe to be Phoenicians today in Lebanon. And that doesn't mean that ancient Phoenician scholars have to, wring their hands about what they're doing necessarily. You can find ways to get along.
So in the Q&A section, there's a comment. It's more of a comment than a question by Scott Johnson, but I want to read it, and then it leads me into a question of my own. He writes, the term Byzantine was in part a way to dismiss medieval Eastern Christianity in a 19th century secularized academic world. It was effeminate, convoluted, Oriental. It feels strangely like dismissing the word Byzantine today in favor of Roman is perhaps serving the same purpose in order to secularize what has come to be known as Byzantium. Would anyone like to comment on that?
So I'm not, hi Scott. I'm not entirely sure what is problematic about secularizing something. I guess if the assumption is that it is not secular, but you're trying to force it into something like that. I am of the opinion that religion generally is overplayed in our representation of Byzantium. And if you don't think that's the case, let me put it to you like this. What if I told you that there's no reason whatsoever to think that Byzantium was more religious as a society than any other pre-modern or ancient society? And yet we don't, and in some ways it was decisively less so. It had some pretty discrete areas of secular activity. But it's not more religious than ancient Athens. I mean, in what way? Look at ancient Athens. I dare you to try to find some area of life that they didn't understand in religious ways. So if that statement sounds strange to you, then you're confirming my suspicion that we've overplayed that card. I'm not saying it should be removed, not at all. It's hugely important, but perhaps a bit overplayed.
And if I could add to that, I think behind that, not anything that Scott, again, hi Scott, would think, but we have such a thick, deep tradition of imagining the ancient world as secular, right? Imagining the ancient world as enlightened and as rational, right? And then the medieval is the age of faith, right? And that's the cleaver that cuts the Roman Empire in half and creates Byzantium, right? So Byzantium can seem crazy religious or intensely religious because we're forgetting that every aspect of ancient Athenian politics was also religious, right? We're forgetting the religiosity and the way that it is interwoven in the politics of the civic structures of the ancient world, right? So referring again to the Great Change, when the classicists worked so hard to overcome the centuries-long prejudice of assuming that the ancient world was secular and rational. That's part of that rise of the West story. We went from rationality, and then we got silly-headed and religious, and then we had the Renaissance, and then we had the Enlightenment, right? That trajectory is deep woven into the DNA of so much history taught that we've been imbibing, that it seems like we're doing a disservice to a medieval society if we talk about the ways in which it is secular, right? And so what I would hope to do in the study of Roman civic religion that I've been trying to write and not doing for a long time, is to show that, they increase our perception, or the Byzantinist perception, of the religious nature of civic politics in Roman Empire before it was Christian, and how that changes and doesn't change in the medieval period. So I think, Scott, that in response to your question, more honesty in thinking about what we're doing and more attention to other fields will help us get further along. It's good to hear from you.
So let me ask maybe what might seem like a surprising question, but is this a uniquely American debate? Right? Is anyone outside of the American academic context, maybe British, even asking this question?
I would guess that Claudia Rapp is.
I know it's certainly being asked in Turkey.
Oh, interesting. Can you say more about that?
Well, I mean, my book was just translated there, like within months. And this was very surprising to me. But so you think about it this way. In Turkey and in Greece, the study of Byzantium is inflected very differently, obviously. And for example, a Roman rubric might make the study of Byzantium in Turkey less politically charged, less tangled up with nationalisms. It's perhaps a more useful rubric. Anyway, I don't think it's uniquely American, but I wouldn't want to, I don't know if I want to venture any kind of, I'd have to think about that. But perhaps it helps to have a community of scholars from all kinds of different nationalities and religions discussing this question, which is not usually what you get in the sort of national academies of the European countries, right? And they're all entangled with Byzantium in different ways, right? I mean, in Greece is a whole other situation. It is an ongoing discussion. It's just its parameters are very different, but it's very much real. I mean, I can assure you from all the questions that I get from Greeks who are baffled about what this thing was in the end.
Alex, is this an active debate in academic circles in Romania?
As far as I know, yeah, there is no interest into discussing and really engaging with these kind of ideas. But as I mentioned in my statement, there were a couple of scholars at the beginning of 1990s when it was a circle around the Department of Orthodox Theology where we were trying to understand, trying to raise this question about the Romans, why the Byzantines were calling themselves as Romans. But obviously, we were, back then we were relying on the edited sources, and still 30 years ago in Romania, the situation with the libraries and so on, it was really, really bad. And we were not able to engage with all the sources that Professor Kaldelis put forth now. So yeah, the situation 30 years ago, it is much different. Probably today, if not so many of my compatriots would have, emigrated for different positions in Western Europe or North America, that would have been a case in Romania. But basically there in Romania and Eastern Europe, I don't think there is a serious debate on this topic. But Florin Curta is interested into that, but he's here in North America.
All right. Well, we've come to our hour. I would really like to thank all of our panelists today. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you like this or other events that we do, we record all of this. We put it on the center's YouTube channel. You can just type into the search Orthodox Christian Studies into YouTube and we will pop right up. Or we have so much content on our webpage at fordham.edu/orthodoxy. Again, let me thank each of our panelists, and I look forward to additional conversations about this in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, George.
Thanks, George.